So, Berto, have you seen the new Black Mirror episode called Bandersnatch on Netflix? Have you seen it?
I have not.
You have.
I've played it.
Oh. So, this is spoiler alert. As with any Black Mirror review, you can't really review it without spoiling it. And two, you can't really enjoy a review of it without having seen it first.
That's right.
It's arguably about an hour and a half of viewing time on
Or
Netflix.
3 hours.
Depending on your decisions. And at the very least, just for the experience of this episode, this sort of TV entertainment, my guess is that it will either spawn a new form of entertainment or it will be something that will define our time as like a gimmick, like fidget spinners or something.
Right.
And so if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's interesting, and then come back to us. So let's talk about the episode, the psychology of it, and the production of it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is, choose your own adventure, Bruno.
Let me think. How many choices do I get? How many seconds? Oh God, I'm so nervous.
Frosties or Sugar Puffs?
Frosties.
Me too. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I make capsaicin-based eye creams.
Yeesh. So I'm just going to go over the plot here real briefly. So it takes place in 1984. Why do you think it was set in 1984? Because it really could have been set anytime.
It could have. Okay, so...
In a sense, I guess.
Yeah, there were a couple things, granted, it could have, you're right. But there were a couple things that lent themselves well. One is, you have this idea of the video game developer that's kind of like the lone wolf, and it's gonna, and that was kind of pretty core to their plot because they wanted to go meta with it, right?
And you couldn't have done that in today's time because
that'd be hard, right?
50 people work on a...
And you could have gone 70s, but then it would be really rudimentary games. And you wanted this idea of he's working on this layered... And the other thing is it was sort of at a time where you were starting to see video games get more complex, right? Yeah. So it was and it was the sort of the dawn of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like a lot of games in the 70s were very much high score kind of games. And then all of a sudden you start seeing a lot more like adventure games and thick plot lines and all that stuff.
Right. And it was, in my memory, the very beginning of the blockbuster game phenomenon, where in the 70s, vast majority of people didn't even know that these, Coleco even existed.
Yeah, it was more like arcade machines were a hit.
Yeah.
Like Pac-Man.
Or Dragon's Lair.
Right.
But this was, 1984, going into the early 90s was when you had that Christmas release video game that everyone talked about and everyone had to have, like E.T., the cartridge.
And there were enough home machines that could play video games that... Yeah.
Right. Okay, so 1984, and also, Brooker, the creator and writer of this episode, is our generation, and, I'm sure he's just like... I mean, if I was Brooker, I'd be like...
80s.
I don't care what the story is. It's taking place. And specifically 1980 to 1985 was when I was, 9 to 14. And I find that period of time to be so enjoyable to what, Stranger Things takes place.
I agree.
During this time. The Americans...
Well, even though I'm a little younger than you, and so we've talked a little bit about this before, I have a more positive impression of the late 80s than you do, for example.
Yeah, I don't.
Right?
Because late 80s to me is like big hair, big shoulder pads underneath the women's, And
all of that stuff I didn't care for. But what I will say is, even though I am a little younger, I still would agree with you that it's like that first half of the 80s that I have the fondest memories about.
Yeah. All right, so our main character here is Stefan?
Oh, he corrects someone, doesn't he? Stefan, yeah.
Stefan.
Yeah.
We learn he's on medication. Yeah. We learn that his mother passed away a long time ago when he was like 5 years old.
He seems highly anxious or something.
He seems anxious. He's alone. Yeah. He's in his bedroom, lives with his dad. We learn later that he blames himself and perhaps his dad for his mom's death. His mom died in a train accident. The train crashed and mom died. And he blames himself because he was 5 years old and delayed his mom getting out the door, which made her miss a train, which made her get on another train, which the train ended up. Again, spoilers. Lives with dad. He's in therapy. I think he's seeing a psychiatrist because she prescribes meds. Apparently, seemingly has no friends. He seems unhappy. He brings an idea for a video game called Bandersnatch to a game company. They hire him to make the game. There's a deadline at Christmas time. He has 5 or 6 months to complete the game. As soon as I saw that, I was like, oh boy, that's not enough time. I mean, you're by yourself and you're trying to create a full game with all the graphics, and you're using that, small little console with
the Sinclair. It's the Spectrum.
Yeah. I'm like, that's not enough time. I mean, did you have the same reaction?
Yeah, not only that, but he was doing a dungeon crawler in first person, which at the time was really hard to do on any system, right? So it's like, yeah, that's going to take you a long time.
Yeah.
And they also set it up right off the bat where you kind of got, like in the first encounter with the other game programmer, you get the sense that he's a successful game programmer and yet he still seems super stressed.
Right.
So it's like the whole thing is like the owner of the game company is trying to crank out the hits and not really caring about whether the programmers are super stressed or not.
Well, and the programmers seem to give off a vibe like, I can do it.
I can do it, right. Yeah, like I'll deliver.
So the plot basically, through the various different twists and turns of the TV show, because it's a choose your own adventure, you can choose different timelines, different stories, is that he's trying to complete this game. That seems to be his main goal, is to complete the game and have it be received well.
Yeah, have it be like a masterpiece.
Right.
And he's basing the game on this book that he really loves, that was a choose your own adventure book, that was kind of regarded in the fiction of the story as one of a kind, like masterpiece of choose your own adventure books.
Right. And it's not a real book.
Right.
And it's, from the looks of it, like a 1,000-page.
Yeah, it's huge.
1,000-page book. And he was basically trying to recreate the entire book in the game.
Right.
And we also learned that the author of this book went crazy, so to speak, as they put it, and cut off his wife's head, and then went to jail or something. I don't know if we know.
Yeah, did he die? Was he alive?
I don't know if they talked about his fate, but either
he
suicide.
Definitely went insane.
Yeah,
and he had used the blood to make this symbol on the walls.
Right. And so he is stressed out trying to complete this game. Things aren't really working for him. He starts to struggle emotionally. He's upstairs in his bedroom trying to complete this game. And he starts to have some strange experiences. And we, as the viewers, are left wondering, is he delusional, or is he legitimately in a world that is trying to control him, or are we the ones trying to control him?
Is his paranoia justified?
Yeah. And, is his father against him? Is his father, an innocent person, blah, blah, blah.
And are we being controlled? And are we in a...
Yeah, it's one big stoner conversation. So let's get into that stoner conversation. Let's talk about the psychology of this episode.
Oh, sorry. One thing before that. The one thing is, I had heard there was a new Black Mirror episode out, but I hadn't read or seen any previews or knew anything about it.
Yeah, me too.
And so I was excited to watch the new episode.
Yeah.
And I was over at my friend Michael's house, and he's a big fan too. In fact, he's the one where... do you remember how when you first saw Black Mirror, you told me, oh, it's terrible because you saw the first episode, right?
Yeah.
I went a year without watching it, and then Michael's the one who's like, you've seen Black Mirror, right? And I'm like, no. And he's like, dude, you got to watch it. It's great. I'm like, but my friend told me the first episode is, oh, yeah, you got to skip the first episode. So he's also a huge fan, and he also doesn't like the first episode, right?
Ah.
But we were like, let's watch this one. And neither of us knew anything. So when the episode started, we were like, wait, what?
Yeah.
We had no idea it was a choose your own adventure.
Yeah, me too. And I'm glad because I saw it come on Netflix like a few days ago, and I was like waiting for a good time I could really sit down and watch it, because I didn't want to just passively watch it.
You can't do that with Black Mirrors.
Right. Because the way I watch TV typically is I will watch while I eat or something.
Right.
And I'll watch for 15 minutes and then pause it. Like right now I'm watching the new Watership Down miniseries on Netflix.
Okay.
Love it. Mike, I read those books when I was a kid. Love the cartoon.
Are those little animals?
Little rabbits. Yeah.
Little rabbits.
But it's like dark, like there's death and war and, And so I have been watching this, 4-episode series over the past few days, like every time I have a meal and I'm by myself. And I didn't want to do that with this one because I wanted to get, but I also didn't want to have it be spoiled for me because I figured I didn't want information to come trickling in.
And that happens with these episodes.
Right. So a couple of days ago, I was like, okay, I gotta watch this or else I'm going to be spoiled. And man, was I glad because I immediately was like, because they immediately ask you this question, like, do you understand these directions? And I'm like, I've never seen this before. Like the ability to choose something during an episode.
Right. Because they show you that little cartoon. And at first when that cartoon starts, I thought, okay, this is how the episode starts.
Yeah.
And this is like someone's watching this. And then the little question comes up and we're both like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And I realized you can't fast forward or rewind.
You can only do that, I think, after the first viewing, and then you can only do it between decision points.
Oh, I didn't even see
and only
that.
in 10-second increments.
Yeah, 10-second increments. That's, Anyway, so let's get into some stoner talk. Free will, Alberto. In this episode, there's a theme of free will. Do we have free will?
Right.
Because Stefan is trying to make his own choices.
Yep.
And there's some poignant scenes, like there's this one scene he's in the psychiatrist's office and he's stressed out and you're like, do you want him to bite his nails or do you want him to pull his ear?
Earlobe, yeah.
And I did both to experiment and they both result in the same thing, which is him resisting the urge. Because at that moment, he's talking to a psychiatrist about how he's learned from the Bandersnatch guy and this other game developer at Tucker Software or whatever, that we are being controlled by something, an outside force of either the government or God or something. And so...
And that he feels like he's felt like his decisions weren't his own or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Which actually can be a delusional thought. Some people will say that. That's what's interesting about this episode is that it watched in a certain way. It's a very common story of a 20-something man just becoming more symptomatic with schizophrenia or psychotic bipolar or something.
Totally.
Where you think the government is out to get you. You start believing your dad is out to get you. You start feeling very afraid. You start getting confused.
Yep.
You start turning to substances. You're isolating. You might get violent potentially if you're pushed in a particular way, and you start making all these weird connections. I'm reading this book and there's this guy.
Well, it's interesting because there's at least two paths where they lead to you completing the game, but in a totally kind of lame way. Like the game is complete, but it doesn't do well because in one case it's too short, in the other case it's too bland. And those are both the options where you seek professional, or not, like where you seek help in a way. One is where you end up working at the game place, which you're surrounded by people, you have a work environment, you're most social, but your game is delivered a little too soon and it doesn't do well in the market.
And it's, as the reviewer states, seems like it's been created by committee.
By committee, right?
Not by an auteur.
But you're fine. You're better off mentally,
right?
And then
you haven't killed anyone,
right?
You seem disappointed,
right?
But it's not the end of the world.
And in the other path, and again, there might be others, but there's another path where it's little ways down the story, but you end up going ahead and taking the pills,
right?
Those are your prescription pills, right. And then you end up being able to complete the game. And again, it's not. It's not great, but so it gets like 2 stars still or something like that. But at least you didn't go insane.
Right. Right. And what's interesting is that the way that Brooker wrote it is that the very first decision that you make is seemingly the most obvious one, which is like, do you want us to help you to develop this game? And so you're like, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Why would I say no at this point? It doesn't make any sense. So you say yes because he knows you're going to say yes. Right. And then he very quickly shows you there are dead ends to the story. There's consequence. So this decision you just made it makes it feel like it's the wrong choice.
Right.
You like the first, did you choose yes?
Oh yeah, we definitely did because, well, even though I remember we were watching it, because remember actually there's one before that, which is the serial.
Right.
And we weren't sure because since we hadn't read anything about it and this stuff hasn't been done in a while, like there's been stuff like this before, but definitely not to this level of production.
Where?
Like choose your own kind of sequences.
Yeah, but where?
There was a movie in 2016 that did this.
There was?
There's been movies in the theaters where people got to vote on things that happened, but never to this level of
how would you do that?
Because they hand out like things and they have multiple.
Yeah,
but it's super expensive and you have to vote and you don't get to have your own choice, of course. And then the only other closest thing were games that were like CD-ROM games that were you know what I mean?
Well,
like
there's been
Guest or
you've heard of Telltale games.
Yeah, and Telltale games, sure.
Those are classic choose your own adventure.
And Dragon's Lair, as you were mentioning, was kind of like that. But
and the choose your own adventure books, of course.
Right. But the point is, we've certainly never played a show that is the high quality production values of a Black Mirror that you get to do meaningful paths in.
Right.
So when we first did the first choice with the serial, we were still sort of like, I wonder if is this it? Like, I mean, are we just doing little trivial things? And we're like, we really hope not, right?
And it's going to route you through a very normal story.
So then when we get to that decision point of like, do you want to work at this company or not? Then we thought, oh, this is interesting. And we said yes, knowing that seems too obvious, but sure, let's go ahead and say yes. And then one argument is like, that's fine. That concludes the story in a okay way, not great.
Right, and it ends up being like a 15-minute or 10-minute adventure at that point.
Yeah, although the guy does give it 0 stars, which I thought was way extreme. Because he said, the game is short, like they didn't finish it. 0 stars. I'm like, what? Come on. Give me 2 stars. So then we went back and did no, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So do we have free will? Berto, what do you think?
So you and I have debated a little bit about this before. So I think in general, I think it is impossible. So depending how you're defining free will, I think it is impossible in the universe we understand and know about to have what we truly mean by free will. And that being that we are some sort of independent entity that is making exclusively fully unpredictable choices as we move through the universe. I think that that's actually impossible because at any given point when we're making a decision, it's all the accumulation of all the stuff in our brain plus all the stuff in our environment. And so you kind of have to say, no, you're actually just picking something that statistically could have been predicted with pretty good ratio of success. That said, practically speaking, we have day-to-day free will for, like I certainly can choose sugar or no sugar in my coffee and things like that. And I can decide to buy the house or not buy the house. So it feels like we have free will, but I don't think we fundamentally have free will.
I dislike the debates that people get into around this. I rarely hear people talking about this and think that I agree with them. I agreed with the first 80% of what you said. It's true that you can predict fairly accurately in broad strokes. Like I predict that, if I could just look at a human and say, I predict that at some point you're going to get hungry and want to eat. I predict at some point you're going to get upset at someone and think it was their fault when it was actually your fault. Like there are broad stroke predictions we can make about humans that are pretty easy.
Yeah, sure, but I'm talking about machinery we don't possess. But for example, if I ask you to say an actor's name, right? Already the possibilities have been narrowed dramatically. First of all, there's only so many actors, period. Second, there's only so many actors' names you've ever heard of. Third, there's only so many actors' names you've heard of that you even remember.
Right.
Fourth, triggers based on today's things that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mentalists do this all the time.
Yeah.
That's their trade. Right. And the fact that they can easily predict what number you're going to choose, they'll be like, pick a number between 1 and 100. And with certain priming, 95% of the time they can get someone to choose a particular number between 1 and 100, which is pretty weird when you think about it. So then you're like, do you actually have free will? Right. Well, I think, these are tricks that are, that have there's a particular set of tricks that will work. But if you take that mentalist outside of those tricks and say, predict so-and-so's behavior over the next week, they're not going to be able to do it.
But totally. But of course, because the variables immediately multiply beyond anyone's possible capabilities.
That's my point, is there's too many variables. Now, again, broad strokes, most people want to eat, go to the bathroom, sleep, have sex, be happy. Most people will like a particular movie. Most people will laugh at a particular joke. And particularly if you profile someone, like an Asian woman who is the age of 30 years old, in all likelihood, she thinks Ali Wong is hilarious. You know what I mean? There's certain things that you can do. And then they say, well, therefore you don't have free will. But we're talking about two different things. We're talking about predictable human behavior, which you could almost say you're predicting how someone will dictate their free will. Just because you can predict someone's behavior doesn't mean you're actually, you're potentially predicting how someone will decide something. You know what I mean? Right. So unless it's like, choose a number between 1 and 100, then it truly feels out of the person's free will. The other side of things is that free will, like, do I have a choice right now to say whatever I want to say, or has it been predetermined? Right. You know what I mean? And there's lots of spiritual kinds of statements, like Michio Kaku, this fellow Japanese guy. He knows a thing or two about astrophysics and chemistry and physics, but he expands that out a lot to some really ridiculous statements. Yeah. And he seems quite convinced of himself. And people regard him as, this speaker of science and of our time.
Like Deepak Chopra does this all the time with quantum physics.
Yeah, it's like, so they'll bring in quantum physics. They'll say, on a Newtonian level, everything's predetermined. You can't control anything. Everything's set in motion. There's no choice. Things just go in a certain way. But, Heisenberg or whoever, Schrodinger, comes out and says, uncertainty principle, and therefore you just never know, and there's multiple universes, and every decision is made, every action is made. But which is in general true, but when you're talking about the the quantum physics uncertainty, you're talking about particles, and when you expand out beyond the quantum, space, and go to the global space of your brain, the quantum mechanics of particle uncertainty is actually generalized to such a level that it doesn't really have a meaningful effect on your decisions.
Well, and like, for example, if you're doing a double slit experiment, right? It's true that you can't individually predict, which side the electron's going to land on, right? However, when you're done shooting a billion electrons, one thing is for sure, you're not going to have a new elephant standing on the left side of the room, because the probabilities of that coming out of that are almost basically zero. So yes, there's uncertainty on, like, within a certain range of movement in tiny, tiny little spaces of the universe.
Tiny.
Yeah, things happen within 60% this way, 40% that way, this kind of things. But at the macro level, this is why we don't see people phase in and out randomly, or the gravity stopped working all of a sudden.
Right.
Yeah.
On the quantum level, there are things that happen that are strange and don't translate into our Newtonian, macro physics ideas of things, and are very unintuitive. Anyway, the point is that a lot of these debates sort of delve into those things, and to me, if I was to break it down into one statement, I would say, in some ways, we absolutely are our decisions are influenced by a lot of things that we probably have a harder time admitting that we don't have a lot of control over. For example, if you're born in a Republican neighborhood and went to a high school that was predominantly Republican, the chance that you're going to be Republican and adhere to, and then the propaganda echo chamber ensues, the chance that you're going to hold certain things as truth, given that cultural pocket you're in, is actually extremely high. And you might actually, even against your free will, completely succumb to it because you're humans now. So there are things that you can say along those lines. Having said that, any particular moment, if I just challenge someone, do you want to eat a hamburger or a hot dog or have waffles? In that moment, you have fucking free will. You can choose.
Practically, as a human in our human world, yes, because it's sort of semantically defined that way. That I somehow, through the mystery of my process, made a choice. I agree with that. However, I think the evidence is against that there is such a thing as free will, because when you average out all humans and all animals, you end up getting predictable macro behavior. Now, sure, you could say, what do you mean predictable behavior? How did you know China was going to do this or that? But I mean, in general, like, people seek food, and I don't mean one individual. I mean, humans move to where there is more water and when there is more resources.
And they, as a collective,
right? And so,
but an individual choice.
Well, but even
I think most people, when they're referring to free will, the average person, that's what they hear. They're like, so you're telling me like every little decision I've ever made in my life, big or small, has not been my choice?
So you would expect something like this in a completely, truly random decision machine. Walking down a street in America, to the left is a hut made out of bark. To the right is like a building made out of crystal. And inside there is artwork made exclusively out of carbonite. And on the other, that's not what you see, right? You see a house that looks like a house that looks like a house that looks like a house. You walk inside, you see like 4 colors of walls, pretty much. You see what I'm saying? People buy a car, they get married, they go to a school. Now, one day they had a hot dog, the other day they had a hamburger. Turns out those are their 2 favorites, and most of the days of their lives, that's what they had. So yes, it seems like moment to moment we're like, yeah, I just made a choice. But really, when you look at the macro, it's like, nah, we're just following along tracks.
They're 2 different things to me. They're both true and not mutually exclusive. For me, for example, I started this podcast. There's a lot of things that could have happened where I could have decided not to do it. But there were several, probably like 1,000 little decisions I made in the mid 2008 where I decided to do this podcast, and there were many other things that I was also wanting to do during that time.
Right, it's just impossible.
That was free will.
Well, it's impossible to pinpoint a moment,
because the other thing is not a lot of people start podcasts.
That's fair, but it's impossible for you to pinpoint a moment before which the possibility of starting the podcast existed, after which it could have gone either way 50-50.
Right. But there was a time where I absolutely can identify where 99% of the probability was me not starting a podcast.
But somehow you did, and we don't have another timeline to reference where actually in the same exact setup of the universe, you didn't start the podcast.
Right. But you can't deny that that isn't evidence of me exerting free will on my decisions.
I don't know, because all I know is the only thing we can
I
reference...
wasn't biologically predisposed to make a podcast.
Well, environment plus biology, I would say yes, right? Everything that happened up
But
until
how
that
many
point-
other people share my general biology and my general environment and don't start a podcast?
Right, but that's where the variables... You started a podcast, but you didn't, for example, start a hemp air colony or something. Like, you started something that was within the realm of possibilities
but you're not
right?
You're not contradicting what I'm saying. You're agreeing with what I'm saying in essence, that broad strokes can be predicted in general most of the time. Mm-hmm. But individual minor choices, especially, along the way, there is a self involved. Now, you could argue that the self doesn't really exist and that we trick ourselves into thinking that we do. Because sometimes I want to move on to our next, because we have a bunch of other things, but the other, evidence that they'll bring up to say that we don't have free will is they'll look to brain science that, very preliminary information, data that shows for some decisions that we make, there's a precursor in the brain prior to us realizing we even want to make that choice. And
sure,
those data are way too preliminary to draw any conclusions.
But to be fair, even if that were like fully vetted, that's just about how you define where the threshold of self lies in the brain. Like, does the self have to be the literally spelled out in English or whatever your language is sentence about what you're doing? Or is the self the gestalt of your entire brain, and therefore at some point in your brain process, a quote unquote decision is made that eventually your literal language part gets informed about?
But it also is silly because the whole conversation requires that you have a pretty firm grasp on what self is.
That's exactly it.
And what consciousness is, which most people don't have a philosophical understanding of.
So just to net out, what I'm trying to say is I firmly believe that it is impossible. I say that it is impossible in the universe we seem to exist in for there to be free will. Like, it's impossible. But that for all practical purposes...
Define in a particular way.
Define in a particular way, which is that truly some entity... and this because of this. Define in the way in which some entity that is outside of that stream of...
Right. So that's the other point I wanted to get to, is that a lot of people basically, when they're... sort of biased against the notion that we have free will, it's basically an atheistic notion that's veiled, and that's the problem I have with it. A lot of people, because a lot of scientists are coming forward and saying like, you don't have free will, and it's just like, and the way they talk, it's like they seem to have a bone to pick that I just recently, after doing a little bit of deep dive, a little mini sort of investigation on this, and I think you actually have this too, you can respond, but is that free will to people like you, they equate free will with the idea of a spirit or a soul or some other non-physical entity that has, agency. Am I wrong?
Well, I totally know what you're getting at, and I've seen that as well. The problem in my mind is that you cannot escape these explanations just by moving into a different realm, because it's the same problem for like, well, we know that the universe had to be created because it's so complex. Therefore, there had to be a creator. But people like me would say, great. But I will say the same thing you just said about the creator you just mentioned. It's so complex, that had to be created. And then you have this infinite regression if you use that line of argument. So I'd say the same thing with consciousness, which is if the claim is, we do have free will and you don't have to worry about all this like quantum or brain or any of that stuff, because the free will comes from a soul, then I would just move into, okay, well, now let's talk about that other realm and where that soul is getting its free will from. Is it independent of inputs?
Right.
Is it blah, blah, blah?
That's not what I'm saying. And I don't think that's what other people are saying either. what I'm saying is that free will and consciousness, which is a related philosophical notion, is a product of physical goo between our ears.
Right. And I'm saying, I'm agreeing with it in the common parlance meaning of free will, which is, I ask you, do you want to go to McDonald's? And you say yes or no.
Right. And so the model that I have, and there's actual research and models and theory in psychology, it's kind of obscure, but I've studied it, that looks at this. It looks at decision making, which is essentially a function of free will. And they recognize that a lot of emotions and cognitions and thoughts and beliefs and experiences and moods and, a lot of different things play into how something feels when we make a choice.
Yep.
Do I want hamburgers or who do I want, a hamburger or do I want waffles?
Right.
Well, every American has feelings about waffles and hamburgers, right. Different feelings. And every American has experiences and conflicts about what one is and what one isn't, and the identity. I'm a breakfast person, I'm a pancake person, I'm a hamburger person. So all of those are out of our quote unquote free will, that they will affect us. But in the end, as all of those things converge, particularly when we really focus on it and say like, which one do I want? And especially when you're aware of those influences, like, well, normally as a man from Alabama, I consider myself a hamburger guy. But you know what? I'm gonna throw that off because I have these other influences and other thoughts I have. I want to do something different this time. I always do hamburger. Today I'm gonna do waffles. Now, there's a lot of things playing into that choice that are pseudo-conscious, pseudo-unconscious, influenced by society, influenced by rumblings in your stomach that you're unaware of. But in the end, I call that process free will. And I don't think anyone can argue with that. Now, if you want to call free will something else, then that's fine. But you have to claim, by the way, as we go into this debate, I'm calling free will this other thing.
Yeah. So like Daniel Dennett is someone that he's a computer scientist and a philosopher, and he would agree with you 100%. He would say like, look, we have to have a term that means what we commonly mean by free will, and plus we use that for the law because we can say, hey, you chose to run that red light, right? Sam Harris, on the other hand, will say, actually, this is one of the problems with our punitive processes of punishing criminals, because he'll say, we think of it like that person chose, in this full free will sense of the word, to murder those people. So we need to punish them and make them suffer for that. But he will claim that, what happened is horrible by our human standards, and that person should be removed from society, blah, 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 blah. However, if you were able to, with an amazingly powerful machine we don't possess, trace back all the inputs that went into that moment, you would see that anyone else with the same configuration would have done the same exact action or very close to it. As an example, when you take it to the extreme and you say, no, look, there was a tumor in his head pushing this part of his brain, and that's what made him grab an axe and start swinging. And when you make it that obvious, everyone goes, oh, okay, it wasn't his control. He didn't have free will.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate absolutely the notion that we in the law and in society should have a much more nuanced perspective and analysis and conclusions when we look at people's behavior, such as murder or crime. However, the notion that we have no choice is philosophically and empirically silly. Now, if I understand the Sam Harris argument well enough, that is essentially another almost spiritual notion that somehow you're just like, or anyway, I'm getting into the weeds, but
it's more about this part. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but I'm putting a little bit of my own. Instead of worrying about was the choice theirs or not, the worry should be, how can we influence people's choices? Because in the end...
And some people consider consequences legally to be a societal influence, a deterrent.
Right. And so like if you think of a child, right, with a young enough child, it's pretty easy to influence their choices with so many things, right? Because you say, do you want this cookie? And they'll say, yes. Okay, well then pick that toy up. And then they'll go, okay. So you could say, oh, they had free will. Yeah, but like they're so little and their brain is so undeveloped that the variables that go into their little choice machine are a lot simpler. And when they want this sugar reward, they're like, oh, okay, I will do this thing that I kind of didn't want to do a second ago, right? So we influenced their choice. You can call it free will as a whole system, but really we were the ones that coerced that quote unquote choice. But when you get older and you're more advanced, it's not so easy. You can't just walk to someone and say, hey, if you don't murder your wife in the next 50 years, at the end, you'll get a gold watch. And then, woo, they're fine, right? That doesn't quite work. So
what an odd example to give.
So what we try to do is like, hey, you'll go to jail if you don't stay on the narrow path, right? And sometimes it works for some people. Sometimes it doesn't work for other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's the point, is like, when you look at lots of different people with very similar backgrounds, you find, a wide variety of behavior. Anyway, let's take a break. When we get back, let's continue the stoner conversation. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome back from the break. If you haven't become a patron of the podcast, do so now. Also, like our Facebook page. Well, I suppose in line with like decision making, how would we apply this to becoming a patron?
If you want to prove to us that there is such a thing as free will, I'm right now going to command you to not become a patron. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong.
So there's also a Big Brother theme in Bandersnatch. Mm-hmm. What Big Brother theme did you find?
Well, if you go through certain paths, you discover that maybe this whole thing is an experiment being conducted by some government agency or the government, whatever, on children as they grow up. And so they are controlling every move. They're watching every move. They're trying to influence their behavior. They're trying to keep them sedated, all these kinds of things.
Yeah. The theme that I picked up on, and I think that Brooker might be potentially writing towards, is that although this was set in 1984, by the way, the book,
right,
1984, a lot of Big Brother in that book. But in 2019, we are becoming more and more controlled by outside forces. Or we've always been, or we're in particular being controlled by outside forces in a scary way or something in today's world. Our news feed is tailored to us, that echo chamber, which affects what we believe. Certain friends might be even fed to us by Facebook or Instagram or something. Advertisers know more and more about our behavior. They know, if you have your settings in a typical ignorant manner on your phone, at any given time, Google, Facebook, Instagram, all three of those, I guess it's two. Mark Zuckerberg and the Google, who's the president of Google right now?
Oh, the CEO.
CEO.
Satya
and Zuckerberg know exactly where you are and probably what you're doing in that moment because of location services.
Sorry, I meant Sundar.
Satya
is Microsoft.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Big Brother is here and it is doing things to you and causing things to happen, like people to believe in very odd things and maybe even pushing people to commit crimes like terrorism and other kinds of things because of the echo chamber they were in and this kind of thing. So I thought that, in this episode, the three programmers, the Bandersnatch guy, Stefan and Colin, all have a kind of Big Brother notion in their minds.
Yeah, and Colin, by the way, the actor that plays Colin.
Yeah.
So when I was watching the show,
well, we'll get into that in a second.
Oh, okay.
Because we'll go into details. Parallel universes is also something that was touched upon. What do you think about parallel universes?
Well, it's funny too because the name Bandersnatch. So it's both the one of the things in Alice in Wonderland. It's like a creature in Alice in Wonderland, and then the whole episode is sort of Alice in Wonderland landy.
Right.
But Bandersnatch, I found out, is also there's this famous book on computational complexity, and in this book, one of the examples they're talking about this corporation that's trying to build these Bandersnatches. And the whole idea in this problem is that you're trying to figure out if it's possible to build these quote unquote Bandersnatches, which are just, it's kind of a stand-in for some product that they're trying to build. But you're trying to figure out if you can build them more efficiently by doing things in parallel or by going sequentially. And part of the problem is figuring out that you can't, even though that there might be the possibility, you can't figure out how to do it in parallel in a more efficient way than going sequentially. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if they did this on purpose. They probably did because they think through these things a lot, is that even though there are all these parallel storylines, you still have to go in sequence through life and through the choices in the show. You can't experience them all at once, which is kind of funny. And there is that theme of like, hey, at every single decision point, a whole different meta or parallel universe opens up. And that leads down to different decisions and different decisions and different decisions.
Sliding doors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that these conversations are fine in one respect, in that when I study parallel universes and the quote unquote evidence for it, the mathematical evidence for it, or justification, I am compelled. I think that absolutely it's possible. But I also find it ridiculous to think about because we have no evidence of it. Yeah. We don't know. And there's no way to currently assess that. Maybe one day we will. Yeah. And actually there are some experiments that are designed to kind of look at that, to see if there are echoes from other universes or other realities that are physical, but they're not like, they're not like God. It's just like another reality that's out of phase with ours or something. Well, but the thing about this is that when physics, they're talking about these branching off points, they're talking about every physical possibility. Yep. Like when we talk about uncertainty, something spinning in a certain way, a particle phasing out of existence, a uranium atom decaying in a particular moment quicker than it would at another moment. That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about our dumbass decisions that humans make.
Well, it would include that, but because there's an infinite number.
Right. But if you just cataloged all the universes, most 99.9999999, to almost infinity of the different universes would be branches of tiny little chemical reactions.
Actually, most of them are empty because it starts at the first instant of the Big Bang. Right. And if, however you construct this thing, if you assume that what's happening is that all the little reactions end up being, taking all the possible variables.
Well, specifically, one question people have is, why was there more matter than antimatter? Right. There's like this slight little, extra surplus amount of matter compared to antimatter, and therefore our universe comprises of what we have. If there was mathematically, there should have been an equal amount of antimatter and matter. And so maybe we're one of those random results in 99.999% of the universes that happened at the Big Bang. Just
nothing happens.
Immediately just blew up in in infinity, of energy, and no matter ever existed.
Right. And so some dude, by the way, just recently came up with a theory and a model, a computer model, that seems to be showing a mathematical model where matter, antimatter do develop and don't annihilate each other from the start of the Big Bang. And like, I don't know all the details, but meaning before this, it was always like there was the feeling that there must be some model or many models that could yield that kind of result. And this guy apparently has, and it hasn't been verified if it checks out, but he's got a model that seems to result in a simulation that doesn't annihilate itself, which is kind of interesting. But to your point, probably all of them minus some insignificant number would be empty immediately, right?
Right. And one of the things that they talk about is if that model pans out, our universe, that was one of the variables.
Right.
Was that model ended up working.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a lot of other physical qualities like the speed of light.
Yeah.
If the speed of light were different, or if the strong, atomic force
Right.
was slightly stronger or slightly weaker, like everything would fly apart or nothing would form. And so there's all these little variables that, again, theoretically could be tweaked slightly different in parallel universes that have a different physical reality.
And then even if you said, no, actually it turns out for some reason, all variables in all possible universes would always end up having to be in the same ranges. Okay, great. Even so, then the next thing becomes every single little interaction within that range of rules yields all its possibilities instantly from the very first instance of the Big Bang.
Right.
Again, leading to the variety is a ridiculous thing. But more importantly, here's the other problem I have with the idea. We certainly have no evidence that there is sort of like anything happening. How do I say this? Like you were saying, like they could measure maybe echoes from the other dimensions and things like that. But
I think gravity.
Yeah, like gravitational
bleeding.
Right. But the assumption there is that these things are even within the same sort of like vicinity, universally speaking, or like where it could be. But you could have a completely different setup where, yes, somehow all the infinite possibilities happen, but each of them is completely encapsulated and unreachable from each of the others, and we will never know, right? Like any of those are possible. And like you said, there's no evidence to assume that right now there's another Berto saying green instead of blue. Like we just don't have that evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Another theme here is, was he delusional or was he actually being experimented on since he was a young age? What do you think, Berto?
Well, it's interesting because if you see that there are multiple endings and possible paths, then the only possible answer, if you take it all into account, is yes and no, meaning it really depends on the path. In some paths, he was absolutely not being experimented with because somehow he went in the past, found the teddy bear, and ended up on the train with the mom. Well, that can't be if she was just an actress and they were just manipulating him. So I don't think it's not possible to say what's the one definitive truth.
Yeah, I like that because in the Choose Your Own Adventure books of old, did you have Choose Your Own Adventure books? Yeah, man, I loved these books when I was a kid. I didn't really like reading that much when I was a kid, but man, with Choose Your Own Adventure, because I was D&D and all that stuff, totally. And it was so great. I still have one of my old Choose Your Own Adventure books, the Third Planet from Altair, and the book was like that. There were certain endings to the story where they completely rewrote they rewrote the characters. Like now you realize like that woman was your mom, and and you're like, whoa. Whereas in another story, it was like the woman wasn't your mom.
Right. So you can't answer it definitively.
Right. I think Brooker is smart in that throughout, if you look at the episode from a whole, even all the different branches, of which I've heard there's 10, by the way, you can't say for sure if he was delusional or not. Because it certainly could fit into a delusional notion, especially because he would often wake up,
Yeah, right.
So it's like, was he dreaming? Or...
Well, and that's the thing with delusions, right? In movies, especially in fiction, is you can make a delusion be as realistic as you want it to be on screen.
Right.
And therefore, anything could be a delusion.
The classic example of this that I love is Total Recall.
Right.
When what's her face from
Sharon Stone.
Yeah, Sharon Stone shows up, and she's like, "Come on, baby, you got to come out. You're still in the thing. You got to come out. You got to come out."
Yeah.
And at first you're like, "Oh, maybe
that's what's going on."
And then he Arnold Schwarzenegger, he starts to kind of second guess the situation
because everything does seem to line up with what was promised to him.
Right. And then then all of a sudden you see Sharon Stone, her face kind of changes, and that guy has a bead of sweat coming down.
Right. Because the doctor even says, listen, if you don't come out now, the walls of reality will become crumbling down and you'll be lost in forever.
Well, doesn't he also say you're going to save the world? That
was what he said when he was going to put him in. But in that moment, he's basically saying, if you don't decide to come out, and I'm paraphrasing, everything is going to shit.
Yeah, you're really going to lose it.
And sure enough, when he makes the decision that he decides to not believe, all of a sudden Sharon Stone goes crazy and everything starts,
Exactly. So it's unclear. So the first time watching it, it's, I was like, oh, he really isn't. And Sharon Stone is a fake wife. Right. You know what I mean? But when you watch it again, you're like, well, wait a second.
It could be either way.
Yeah. Another theme in the Bandersnatch episode is grief and guilt. What did you see about that, Berto?
Oh my gosh. I thought that scene with did you get to the one where they incept the memory?
Yeah.
So there's that path where they show that it was actually, if he's part of this government experiment, and they give him some sort of drug, hallucinogen or something, in his little cupcake, and they take the bear away, and then they make him think that the mommy is just some actress, but that his mommy is leaving, and that then she dies. And I thought, oh my gosh, that could totally work with a young enough child. I mean, maybe, you'd have to tweak a lot of things, but because then from there on, he feels like he's responsible for that death. And when you do it at a young enough age, it doesn't matter how much conscious time you spend saying, no, but it's not my fault. It's not my fault. Deep down inside, you're like, but it is my fault. It is my fault. And that could ruin your life.
Yeah. Kids often blame themselves for things like this, especially younger children. I've seen this before. One story I talk about on the podcast sometimes is I had a family client, and the parents had recently divorced, and the father had moved out, and the kid, who was around 10 or something, was 100% convinced that it was his fault that the parents got divorced. And so I sat him down. I was like, why is it your fault? And I thought he'd say something, well, it's because I was a bad kid and it stressed out my parents or something, something somewhat rational. But what he said was, well, my dad told me to mow the lawn when I was, 7 or something. And I said that I didn't want to, and I, continued watching TV. And then a little bit later, my dad came downstairs and sat us all down and said that
they were getting a divorce.
They're getting a divorce.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before on the podcast, where when I was little, so, my parents split up when I was 3, and I never understood why. And I would ask my dad, why did mom leave? What happened? And he never had a satisfactory answer, right? He would say stuff like, man, people grow apart, but whatever, right? I never understood why. And it was always like this, but why? Where's the truth? And I talked with my therapist a lot about this, because I had 2 themes around this. One of them was this intense desire that my life's mission was to somehow reunite our family. Not just my mom and dad, but our entire family. So my dream was one day to buy an island, because I was going to become so wealthy and powerful that I was going to buy an island and move everyone there so we could all be together, everyone from Colombia and everything, right? And this isn't something like when I was 10 years old. I was talking to her about this when I was 30. Yeah, and by 30, I was sort of talking about it in a kind of a wink way, but sort of not. I really did have that held onto it. And the second theme was basically that guilt part of, what was it me? What did I do? Because there's no reason. And so I always had this there's got to be a truth, and no one is telling me the truth, and so I must be part of the problem.
What? Because the recounting that you said that your dad said,
Yeah,
is true, right?
Yeah.
He probably told you. From my understanding, your dad kind of treated you like an adult in some ways.
Yeah,
And said adulty like things. Like if a friend came to me and said, "Yeah, we're getting a divorce," and I was like, "Oh, why?" And he's like, "Well, we grew apart." Like I would understand. Like that's all you would have to say to me. I would know what that meant. It was like conflict.
Right.
You're no longer in love.
And
maybe you're even wanting to date other people or something. And so, what could he have said to you or expanded more? Do you imagine having to understand what really happened?
I don't know at which age this could have worked, but I do think, because I remember still like at 8 having these conversations with him. I think I maybe needed to hear explicitly, first of all, hear that it wasn't my fault. And maybe he did, and I just don't remember, but it clearly didn't happen enough to where I clearly remember it, right? Number one. Number two, maybe something along the lines of examples I could relate to with shows or friends that I was friends with or had a fight with or something like that.
Yeah.
Because I don't remember anything that I could relate to.
Well, and it's possible that you were doomed because at the age of 8, you have no idea what it's like to be not even in a romantic relationship for a day, let alone a decade,
It's hard.
What if your dad had said something like, "Well, we both fell in love with other people," or something? Would that have helped?
But I didn't know what fell in love meant. The other thing he was trying to do, which I think he definitely meant well, and maybe it was good, but so he was trying not to say anything bad about my mom to me, because even though he was infinitely upset at her, and of course she had infinite reasons to be upset at him, he didn't want me to have, he didn't want that to cloud my relationship with my mom, right? But that made everything even more confusing because no one was saying anything bad. The other thing that must have been really, really weird is that I did remember all these yelling and some sort of problems.
Well, what if he had said, "We fought so much about things and we're so angry at each other that we couldn't stand being around each other"?
Maybe, who knows?
But then you'd probably be like, "Well, what were you fighting about?
Were you fighting about me? I don't know."
Yeah.
It is a hard thing.
But that is interesting that your intuition tells you that you needed probably repetitive messages and convincing that it was not your fault.
Absolutely. Because all I remember is, first of all, when she left.
I mean, that's one part of it is not only did your parents divorce, but your mom ditched you.
Yeah.
Just moved out of thousands of miles away.
Yeah. And that was part of what was.
And that has to feel like a personal attack.
Absolutely, right?
Shouldn't I be good enough to make you at least try to be in the neighborhood?
Totally. And part of the problem is that since she essentially disappeared initially for the first few days, my dad literally didn't know where she was, right? And then, so this instilled in me this thing of where is my mother? And so apparently, and I sort of remember this, but for a while we'd be driving and I'd be like, "Oh, there's my mom. There's my mom." And I'd see some lady from the back or something. And my dad "No, that's not your mom." I'm like, "No, pull over. We have to. That's my mom."
Oh my God.
I was always looking for her because seeing her everywhere.
That's heartbreaking.
I know, man. So I can totally understand these traumatic things, and then you take it upon yourself, whether you're aware of it or not. And it has an impact on your decisions, on your relationships, on,
Yeah. All right. Other themes. I just want to race through them because I want to get to some other things about the episode. There's a theme of LSD opening up your mind to creativity. I'll just comment on this a little bit. Yeah, for sure, it can be done. There's some research that points in some directions around this. But really, think about all the people who have taken LSD and all the times they've taken it. I mean, how many of those people, upon taking LSD, suddenly like created something awesome? You know, it's probably a very small percentage. And also, how many people who have created something awesome have not taken LSD ever? Do you know what I mean? So the chance that taking LSD is going to somehow unlock your creativity, it's not very high. Having said that, some people will say that, you know, taking LSD even just once or mushrooms or similar psychotropics will swear that after taking it, you know, really gave them a whole new perspective on life that sustained after taking it.
Well, you could say, so like take the Beatles, whom we love, right? So on the one hand, you could say, wow, you know, after they did some psychos and went to India, everything changed. On the one hand, that's true, but not everything that came out of that was good.
Right.
It was experimental and different.
Well, and there's a clear linear progression from Help to Rubber Soul to Revolver to Sgt. Pepper. People often think, well, Sgt. Pepper, 1967, Summer of Love, clear, you know, just like boom, sudden change. You know, they got the weird outfits, psychedelia, everything. But if you listen to Revolver and Rubber Soul, there are precursors. Absolutely.
Totally.
Just, you know, so, you know, it's a little silly. And plus, think about all the musicians out there who have taken LSD and how many of them have created something like Sgt. Pepper's.
Right.
Like very few.
Absolutely. The other thing that I found really interesting is if you take follow the White Rabbit dude and go to his place and take the LSD route and then he jumps off because you tell him to jump off.
I didn't realize he has white hair.
Yeah, I did. Michael pointed that out. I was like, yeah, you're right. So if you follow
Did you know that he had to turn off his Twitter because of people hating him online?
After this?
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second.
No, I didn't. So, but if you follow that path, that's what opens up more of the government conspiracy path. But what's interesting is you can get what I would call the winning path of this game without following him at all. And he ends up being around later in the story if you don't make him jump off to his death and all these kinds of things. So I would have thought that, okay, well, to get like the best game and have it ship on time and all these kinds of things, I was thinking, well, you got to get high, but you actually had to go a different route to kind of end with, again, what I would call the best. Well, although it's funny because the best scenario that I'm talking about still involves chopping up your dad, killing and chopping up your dad.
Yeah, we'll get into endings in a second. Another theme here is unethical research, which I've talked about on this podcast before. Also, I want to talk about the psychiatrist and her behavior. Most of it I thought was fine. Whenever I see a therapist on the screen, I instantly get, uptight because most of the time there's something cringeworthy, if not the entire, writing of it is cringeworthy. But for the most part, I was like, okay, except for a couple things. One was, on the second visit, she says something I'm paraphrasing, but she says something along the lines of, it sounds like you're beginning to dissociate, but you're not delusional yet. So we need to up your dosage. And I won't go into the details, but that is a nonsensical statement. Like dissociation has nothing to do with delusions, but you could see how someone would think that.
Yeah.
They would think, oh, dissociation, that kind of sounds like dissociating from reality.
Yeah.
Which it is in essence, but it's complete separate condition than delusions. And to me, whenever I hear stuff like this, like when I go to Japan or Mexico or something, or Colombia for that matter, and the English is so bad, I'm just like, all you had to do was ask any person off the street. You wouldn't even have to pay him money. You could just call a therapist and say, I'm thinking about having these three sentences in my show. Does it make sense to you? Most therapists would be like, no, that's a nonsensical statement.
Right.
Like all you have to do is change this one word. Like all you had to do was take out the word dissociation. Like you could have just said symptomatic.
Right.
Like it sounds like you're becoming more symptomatic or something along those lines, but you're not delusional yet. So here's up to your meds. That's all that was needed. That's the only thing that needed to happen. And it, like in Japan, there are certain things, and I'm sure it happens in the States too, where some, Japanese symbols or language being used, and it's all bastardized. It's like, all you got to do is ask a third grader who speaks that language, does this make any sense to you? And they'd be like, no. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. I've seen that. So whenever they're translating stuff to Spanish, and I've seen that all the time, where I'm like, oh man, you didn't ask, or you asked, but only one very narrow region of the world that speaks Spanish, and that thing is not universal at all,
right.
And it sounds totally wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, at a certain point, the therapist does an intervention. I think the second or maybe it's a third visit. She asks him to go through his beliefs. She's like, okay, well, let's look at what you believe here.
Right. This is when she's like, so, I mean,
why isn't it more entertaining?
Right. If this is all someone's controlling you, and presumably they're watching you for fun, right? Like, shouldn't this be like more like, why are you talking to a normal woman in a normal office in the middle of a non-interesting part of the world?
Right. So on one level, this intervention was actually somewhat accurate. You will see therapists do this, especially with people who aren't full-blown delusional. Mm-hmm. There are some people who sort of skirt the edges of delusion and can cognitively combat their own delusions, or at the very least give them the motivation, like, oh, maybe I should be taking more medication because yeah, you're right, this doesn't make any sense. But
I wonder if it's similar to when I started feeling panic attacks, but I had already gone through it and stuff. I was able to not keep going downhill and stop myself and breathe and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's similar, but with delusions, for most people who suffer from actual psychosis, you cannot think your way through it when you're fully symptomatic. You can't. And I've had conversations with psychotic people before and tried that, because that's all I have. I don't have medication. I don't, all I have is like, let's challenge these beliefs, and they're completely impervious.
You can't give them a little top to see if it spins indefinitely.
But at the same, and then for people who have watched this time or this branch of the story, this is when she busts out the katanas.
Which is great. So two things about it. The other thing I thought about when she's saying, hey, shouldn't this be more interesting if someone's watching you? I don't know if they meant this piece, but they must have, because if you think about shows and movies in the 80s, not a lot of them took place in just a normal conversation in a normal setting. There were some movies that explored that, but most, if you watch TV, everything was over the top. A-Team, Airwolf, like everything was over the top, right?
Well, particularly stuff we watched when we were children.
Mainstream pop stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like you'd have to be watching, and movies where like Steven Spielberg, all these, like big, right?
Yeah, there were things, Dinner with Andre.
That's what I'm saying, though. Those were rare, kind of like, okay, I've seen that movie kind of thing.
But you could make the same argument of today. Like 14-year-olds of today, I imagine when they're in their 40s, 30 years from now, they will say, man, movies in 2019, they were all over the top. You got Avengers and Black Panther.
Well, okay,
and you didn't have any small movies, but there are small movies right now, but no one sees them.
Well, but I guess I think about it like, you've seen now since the 90s, you've seen so many things come out that was like just in normal settings and people just having relationships.
But I think those movies existed in the 70s and 80s, but you and I were totally unaware of them, is my point. Like, I bet you if we asked someone who was 10, 20 years older than us, they'd be able to rattle off a number of movies from that time.
But even the advent of reality TV, like the real world was different, because all of a sudden, this is not like it was like people in a normal house. I mean, of course, now we know it's
your broader point. I understand, which is that the writer Brooker was commenting on entertainment, whether it's from then or now or whatever, that typically it's not so subdued.
Right. And they were almost making a dig at itself, right? Like, how can this show have two people just here talking?
So this reminded me of a movie that you and I both love, which is what? You're going to kick yourself when I tell you
a movie that is subdued, or
no, that has this turn in the middle of or toward the end of the movie where it's kind of bland.
Yeah.
And then there's this suggestion to change this meta suggestion to change the story to be more interesting, and then the movie actually takes this total.
Well, Total Recall does that.
No. Adaptation.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a writer who is writing a screenplay, and then his brother or his editor at some point is like, "This is fine, but it needs more exciting." And then finally, Charlie's like, "Okay, fine, I'll make it more exciting." Right. And then that's when you get the gunfights and the da 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 da.
Well, because he literally earlier in the movie says, "I'm not gonna do a thing where people learn and they grow from their mistakes," and then you have all these, and like he kind of goes through all the things that end up happening.
Right. And he gives in at the end. Right. And so this TV show had that thing of, it's like, so if this is supposed to be entertainment, why has it been so boring up until this point? And then he takes it in that more interestingly. The last thing I'll say about psychology and about Bandersnatch is that if you are suffering from delusions, I should have said this at the beginning, or are on the edge, you probably should not watch this TV show, because it's sort of, especially with the choose your own adventure elements, you become potentially, if you like this sort of thing, you become particularly engulfed in the story. And as I was watching it, I started to feel kind of weird about it.
Yeah. In fact, because when I was doing it, like we spent seriously like 3 hours going through it, and I left, it was like 2 a.m. or something, and walking out in the rain at 2 a.m. to my car, it felt a little weird. In fact, I was joking to Michael as I was leaving. It's like, all right, I hope I make the right choices now,
Yeah. Similar to having watched a horror movie.
Right.
You walk in, to a dark room, you're going to think is Pennywise on the other side of the bed. It's similar to this movie or this TV show. You watch it afterwards, you're like, is someone controlling my behavior? Right. What out of 10 would you give this?
So this is an interesting one, because I'm going to kind of give it 2 ratings. One of them is sort of on the whole continuum of entertainment. I think this one has to be like, I'm going to give it an 8.5.
Okay.
Because it is a new milestone. Mm-hmm. And I almost would give it a 9, because I sort of felt watching this or experiencing this, some of the feelings I had when I first experienced The Matrix.
Right.
In that The Matrix was a new thing.
Yeah.
And it introduced not a lot of new elements and things. And I think this one also did that. However, ultimately, there are a couple of flaws with it, even just in themselves. One of them is that if you look at the overall story from beginning to end, any one of the paths, it's not quite as good as one of the complete Black Mirror ones that we love, I think. The second one, really, I didn't notice until I went back and replayed it with someone else, which was, I thought that you had to really discover the right combination to get to what I thought was the great ending or the best ending. But then when I replayed it with someone else and we just kept going back, it kept forcing you back to do all the other choices. And eventually you end up with that ending anyways. And I thought, oh, well, that's a little cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's true. But what I think Brooker did was, he said, I'm going to give people a choice. They can either bag out whenever they want. They get to an end. They can say, okay, I'm done. But we'll give them a choice to say, hey, if you want to go back and try these other branches, go ahead. But the problem was it felt like another choice instead of like, by the way, you just ended a story.
Right.
And so if you want to go back, you can, but you probably should just walk away.
So because that is with Michael and I, we reached one ending, it was the quick ending, right? Then we reached like another one that was also bad. And then we reached one that lasted longer and ended with the game being released, but only being like 2 out of 5 stars.
Did you pour tea on the computer?
I'm sure we definitely did that at one point, yes.
But first, did you do that first?
No, I think I banged the table.
I did. I was just like, I want this computer to die.
So, but
that ends the story right there.
Right. But so when we got to that one ending that was like 2 out of 5 stars, we were like, okay. And then we were thinking, oh, maybe there's no way to like, but I thought, no, come on. There's got to be a better rating we can get.
Well, now
so we
you're-
restarted the whole thing.
Yeah, well, now you're playing it like a video game.
Right,
You're
totally.
trying to get the best score.
Right. And so we restarted the whole thing from the beginning and then fast forwarded through the things and we won, quote unquote. We got to the longest, best ending, in my opinion, right?
So you chop your dad up and you...
It was where you chop the dad, the guy comes over, you don't kill him.
Right.
That's the key, is you don't kill Colin.
Yeah.
And that makes it so that you end up releasing the game. You still end up being found out as a murderer, but the game gets released. It gets 5 out of 5 stars. And then you get the bonus ending.
But you're still in prison.
Yeah, but you get the best rating and you get the bonus ending. Right? So to me, that was winning the game. And I thought
But that's not winning the game. The dad is dead.
Well, in life, you make some choices. But I thought, okay, this is great. We won it, and because we actually talked about the decision. So, like, well, if we do this, and we're like, don't go to Collins because we don't want him to die, because we want him to be there later, because we want him to show up. And then don't bury the dad because we don't want the dog to find him. And then we're like, but don't kill Colin, because we did all that. But then later when I was doing it with someone else, I realized like eventually it forces you all the way back through those options anyways, and eventually you get that ending if you keep playing.
Yeah, it's not a game.
Right.
It's not.
But it should have been.
But it's not a logical.
Right.
It's not like, well, if you're smart, because honestly, if you're smart, you should take the job in the beginning. It's dumb to say no to that decision. So right off the bat, I think Brooker is saying, look, this isn't going to be a logical scenario, and the way I love choose your own event, like I've played the Telltale games, the Game of Thrones one. I love Telltale. If people are aware of it, they went under, so they're not going to create any more Game of Thrones Telltale games. I love choose your own adventure. Any game, like there are stories that you can buy that are choose your own adventure too. Where you read a page and then you on the computer. And I love these things so much. And so when I was watching this episode, I was treating it like I am him, because I love playing. This is Dungeons and Dragons. It's like an easier version of Dungeons and Dragons because you don't have to have a dungeon master, do it for you. It's sort of there's less decisions you actually can make, You watch me when I play Dungeons and Dragons, I get into that stuff.
Yep.
Because it's fun for me to get into decisions and consequences.
Yeah.
Some of which you just don't know. You could make the wrong choice and something really bad could happen.
Right.
Like in Dungeons and Dragons, I was playing once a long time ago, and actually the dungeon master was the police officer I had on not too long ago. Anyway, and so I was a thief, and there was another thief in the party, and so I was my role playing character was like, well, we would be friends.
Okay.
And we walk up to a door, and the dungeon master's like, okay, you're at a door. What do you do? And the thief grabs the doorknob and said, okay, well, I'm going to open the door. And so he touches the doorknob, and then this portal opens up, and the thief gets sucked in to this dark hole. And I'm like, oh shit. I jump in after him, because I think, well, I want to, where he goes, I'm going to go. And where he lands, I'm going to be there to protect him. So I jump into the black hole, and the dungeon master looks at me and he's like, what, why did you do that? And I'm like, well, because, I'm a thief. He's a thief. My character thinks he's cool. I'm trying to buddy up to him. And so I decided to do that. He's like, well, I'm going to give you a chance to take that back because something bad is going to happen.
It's like the therapist saying, are you sure you don't want to talk about your mom?
Right. And so I said to him, I was like, no, that's what my character did. Like, I guess if something bad happens,
then what happens.
That shit happens, otherwise I'm playing a game.
Right.
Like I'm not playing a game. This is role playing. I'm in the character.
Okay.
It's funner to be in the character and lose than to game the system and win and not actually feel like I'm in the character. And so he says, well, he's like, okay, fine. And I think I might have told the story in the podcast before, but what him and the thief had done was the thief was tired of playing his character. And so the DM was like, well, you can't just walk off of the party. So we have to devise a way to kill you.
Oh,
so I'm going to make a trap where when you touch a door, you're going to get sucked in, you're going to die. But they didn't tell me about that.
Right. And so you just jumped in too.
Yeah. Anyway.
Did you die?
No, well, what he said, I can't remember what he said, but he's like, so you have to sit out this entire session.
Okay.
And we'll figure out a way to bring you back
Okay.
to life. Yeah.
Well, so here's the thing. The first time through...
Which honestly was kind of a dick move because it was like 5 hours of me just sitting there watching everyone else play.
So, you know what would have been funner is if you got to play in that other dimension for a bit or something. But,
right. That's what Adam would do.
Right.
He would have figured out some...
So what we did the first time through is do what you just said. We pretended we are that character.
Okay.
And so we said yes to joining the team. And then, well, okay, fine, we'll say no. And then we're like, well, let's follow Colin because we're kind of worshiping Colin, right? And then so we kind of follow, and we're like, we're not going to jump off. We're not that crazy, right?
Right.
We're not going to kill our dad, right? Let's not kill our dad. We did all that stuff. It was like the third time through when we said...
I bet you a lot of people did that time.
Probably,
that's the timeline
right.
I did, yeah.
And then the third time through is when we restarted from the beginning and trying to game it to see if we could... Because our goal then was, can we get a higher rating for the game?
Right. So for me, I would say almost the identical thing to you about the rating of the episode. I would say that it was an 8 on the experience scale.
Uh-huh.
But story-wise, or when I just think back on the themes of the episode, I'd give it like a 5 or a 6.
Yeah.
If this was not a Choose Your Own Adventure episode, I would have considered this to be not only one of the worst Black Mirror episodes, but maybe not even worth my time.
But they right, because they didn't actually... Because if they were constructing it as a linear episode, the themes were all very interesting, and they could have woven it together brilliantly. But for example, you couldn't in the same episode have had all those elements. You wouldn't have wanted to.
But even if you chose most of the elements, he starts off trying to make this game. He finds out that the guy who made the game, killed his wife and had all these and started to go crazy. He starts to kind of go crazy. He kills his dad, and then he finds out that he was being experimented on or whatever.
Yeah.
You'd be like, if I saw that episode, I'd be like, that's pretty dumb. Like that's pretty silly. You know what I mean? Was he delusional? Was he not? Who cares? You know what I mean?
But I think there's a way that you could have constructed it. For example, the whole premise of the episode, you believe, is about this kid trying to finish this video game in spite of all these problems he's having mentally, right? And then it seems like the episode takes this turn to, wait a minute, maybe he is not crazy, and there is some pan-demon trying to kill him. And then, but you're like, but this is Black Mirror. Usually they don't have stuff like this. And then it's only at the end when the dad is dead, the game is successful, and all these things that it comes out like this thing, he was part of an experiment. I mean, something along those lines, right?
If it was directed well enough, it could have been like a Donnie Darko or something. But I don't know.
Okay. Well, but I think we agree on the core, which is they had to sacrifice, I mean, I don't know if they had to, but they sacrificed on the overall cohesiveness of the beginning to end story and the quality of it, I should say. But it is a milestone of entertainment.
Totally. I might even give it a 9 for the experience. Yeah. Maybe even a 10, because the way I felt the first hour I did this was, really something new. I had never felt like this while I was watching TV.
Right.
And the seamlessness of it that Netflix did, the technology, the simplicity, although the decisions were probably the decision countdown was a little long. I think they gave people an extra 5 seconds to really make sure that you didn't blow past people before grabbing the remote or something. But it's really, it is a milestone. It'll be interesting to see if this, I hope it does, spawn a whole set of entertainment along these lines. So
it sounds like it is, because for one thing, I heard there's a new like Puss in Boots or something coming out for kids. That's Choose Your Own Adventure.
Well, actually, I read online that there have been Choose Your Own Adventure for kids already.
Okay.
That has been under the radar because it's been for kids. So the Puss in Boots would be totally... But what I hope is they make it for adults, right?
Yeah, right. Well, so it sounds like, for one thing, one of the goals for this, from what I can read into this, is I think, I don't know who exactly first pitched the idea of doing it this way, but in the process of developing this one, which took them like 18 months or something like that, right? They developed the tech that they can now reuse for trying to do this again, which because it wasn't just writing the story and filming all the parts. As you pointed out, the tech is part of what made this successful.
Right. Netflix had to figure out an interface that was comfortable and made sense and would work with remote controls and computer interfaces. But the thing that really astounded me was how quickly the decision loaded. Right. You know, like you're essentially playing a video game that has a set of different videos. Actually, this reminds me that this has been done before in the 80s with laser discs.
Right.
Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, my friend had a Laserdisc player, and they came out with these, they were big-ass CDs, essentially, big DVDs, and you would do that. You would use your remote control, you'd make a choice, and then it would skip to a different part on the Laserdisc player, and you would see another, because it was you could do that with a Laserdisc where you couldn't do it with a VHS tape because the VHS tape would have to fast forward, blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, I was so astounded. I was like, man, this is seamless.
Yep.
And
they filmed it in a way where the story never felt like janky, you know, like, I see, they just stitched that in.
Right. And not only did it have to be seamless, but several of the backtracks or whatever had to have a recap that was really quick. And so that was genius in terms of like, how do you recap the story up to this point to help people know you're on this timeline? And
I don't know if you noticed at one point when you're replaying it and you're skipping through, it gets to a point where you're trying to make a decision, and Colin, the character Colin, says, look, just skip to the next part. Fine, I'll do it for you. And he claps and the scenes skip forward.
Right.
Like Colin was essentially the in the know character. He knew what was up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was but you could also argue he was just insane and killed himself because he thought that he was in a different, sort of universe that he's not really in. Where does this fit into all the various different Black Mirror episodes?
As far as my rankings? Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's got to stand on its own because, like we said, it is an experience.
Yeah.
I still wouldn't change my top 3 story-wise. I still think the Christmas one is up there. I think the one we said...
Hang the DJ?
Hang the DJ is just amazing.
USS Callister.
That one's amazing. And also the nosedive and stuff. So I think this one would be in my... Like, because of the experience, if I add it all together, it's probably making my top 5. It's number 5 in my list.
I put it in my top category. White Christmas is my favorite.
Yeah.
I loved Be Right Back. I think about that, the robot husband.
Oh, yeah, right.
I think about that one like every couple weeks. Yeah. Somehow it'll just pop, like a conversation I'm having or something. San Junipero I love. Hang the DJ, USS Callister. The Entire History of You I really liked. The cheating wife.
There's a lot of good ones.
The Shut Up and Dance one, the pedophile kid.
Yep.
That one was pretty great. White Bear. I really liked White Bear, especially, again, I always have to rate the first time watching it.
Which apparently the glyph not only represents the choice making, but that was the white bear symbol.
Exactly.
Which I didn't put together.
Oh, I did right away.
Really?
Right away. I was like, there's the...
I didn't remember that.
Yeah. Archangel, the spying on your kid. Not everyone liked that. That one was directed by what's her face from Silence of the Lambs, Clarice.
Oh, okay. I remember. That's right. But it's hard to place this one in there because you gotta judge them.
Well, for me, I put it at the end of this long list of my favorites, and Playtest is also on the list. So I put Bandersnatch at, I guess it'd be like the 12th best or something.
So I would be more generous because of the experience being so, and I would shuffle it into my, at least my top 10.
But it's so hard because
it is hard.
If
someone said, okay, you have to delete the other ones, or at least one of them of your top 10 to put this one in, and never have that one exist, it's hard to make that choice. It
is, because it's such a different thing to me. It's like not, I don't know.
Yep.
And then the other one, the next category, I just say, they're good. I liked them. I love Black Mirror. It's like trying to pick bad Beatles songs or something. Crocodile, the woman who spirals downward,
Right.
Metalhead, 15 Million Merits, and Nosedive. I put in that category. Great episodes, would rewatch, but I wouldn't put them in up with White Christmas, that kind of thing. And then the okay episodes that I sort of endured, and they're fine. They're better than probably 99% of everything on TV today.
Yeah.
You know, think about every, 2 Men and a Baby or 2.5 Men or whatever. The Waldo moment, Men Against Fire about the soldiers,
Right.
and Hated in the Nation, the Bees one. I thought, it's fine. I didn't really like him as I was watching him.
Did you put Metalhead in there already?
Metalhead's in my also good, the second category, yeah. And then I really did not like Black Museum or the Pig episode.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So yeah, directed by David Slade, who directed Hard Candy.
Sorry, the Bees one also not good, right?
Right, exactly. I put the Bees in the Waldo moment, Men Against Fire. David Slade directed Hard Candy. I love that movie from 2005. He also directed the Twilight Saga, one of the Twilight movies. And he directed Metalhead, the Black Mirror episode, written by Charlie Brooker, who created Black Mirror. Fionn Whitehead plays Stefan Butler. Do you know what other movie he's been in?
The war one.
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, yes.
Will Poulter plays Colin Rittman, which I did not know he was British. I thought he was, because everything I've seen him in, he's been an American.
Well, so this one was the funny one for me. When the show starts, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know this actor. Why can't I place him? And the thing I kept coming to in my mind was the neighbor kid in Toy Story.
Oh.
Because he kind of has that look.
Yeah.
But I'm like, so I've seen him where he was little or younger in something.
Son of Rambo?
That's the one, but I didn't remember until today. I looked it up and I was like, Son of Rambo. Didn't we watch that one together?
Maybe.
I think we did. That's the one we went to and watched.
If you Google guy with eyebrows, he's the one who comes up. Because his eyebrows are so weird,
I like them a lot. He did a good job. Yeah.
He was in Narnia, the Don Treader episode. He was like the dick kid. We're the Millers. Have you seen We're the Millers?
No.
It is hilarious.
Okay.
Jennifer Aniston, and Jason Sudeikis.
Oh.
And Will Poulter.
Wait a minute.
We're the
Have I seen that?
It is hilarious. A drug dealer has to go to Mexico to get like a bunch of weed.
Oh no, I haven't
and
seen this.
He hires this family to be his family so that they can travel and look innocent. And
wait a minute. Wait, is this the one where at one point the Thor actor Chris whatever is there?
No, I don't
that's
think
some other movie.
Yeah.
Then. Okay.
It's I've rewatched this like 2 or 3 times. It's funny.
Okay.
The movie is funny from beginning to end. Okay. And Will Poulter has some good lines in it. He was also in The Maze Runner, which one of the runners.
I have seen We're the Millers.
And he was in The Revenant, as you remember him from The Revenant. And he was also in Detroit. Have you seen Detroit? The movie came out last year about the Detroit riots and stuff. Okay. And he's
was he a skinhead or something?
No, he's an asshole cop.
Okay.
He's the asshole cop. Okay. But it's interesting because I thought he was an American because he nails an American accent. So, and for the first couple of minutes, I'm like, his accent is bad because he kind of has a weird voice in this episode.
Yeah.
But then I looked him up. He's like, oh no, he's British. Yeah. So yeah, Metacritic gave it 61%, and there's a lot of people who hate this episode. And I think the reason why is because Black Mirror, similar to Game of Thrones, there's a certain point where it emerges from a cult hit, underground cult hit, to massively overblown mainstream something or other.
Right.
For the first 3 or 4, maybe 5 seasons of Game of Thrones, like only people like you and me watched that show.
Right.
The vast majority of people didn't even know about it. And if they did, they're like, I'm not into that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then there was a certain point, season 5, maybe season 6, where it became the it show.
Well, I actually didn't start till season 2 because I had heard about it. I heard it was, I'm sure you talked about it, all these things. But I had this idea in my head that it was like Lord of the Rings for TV or something.
Right.
Which it kind of is, but not at all also.
Right.
And so when I finally saw season 1, of course I was hooked. But you're right, after some season, it blew up to some ridiculous degree.
And when that happens, inevitably there's a backlash because too many people who aren't really that into it are watching it. And also, of the people who are sort of nerding out on the thing, they don't maybe like the fact, it's like when Disney buys Star Wars or something, it's like everyone's upset because it becomes too mainstream. It feels too mainstream or something. And so there's this huge backlash against this episode because there's nothing that Brooker could have made that would have lived up to the hype.
No.
Similar to episode 7 of Star Wars, there's no way that you could have created a movie that could have pleased every person.
I wonder if they would have branded it differently. It could have been the same exact thing, just branded differently.
Not Black Mirror.
Yeah, even though it's got all the Black Mirror references, it clearly, anyone who watches is like, wait, is this Black Mirror? But if they had named it Bandersnatch, no Black Mirror branding.
Well, I think they kind of did this like on Netflix. It's the main graphic. The main graphic just says Bandersnatch, and I and many others thought that they would dump the whole season. So anyway, the point is that there's this backlash, which I find to be funny because. To me, unless you're really not into role playing, which I get, like if the gimmick doesn't work on you, this episode's really dumb.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like but to me, if you're into it, it's a good experience. So Will Poulter, I think yesterday announced on Twitter that he was closing his Twitter account because he's getting tons of hate mail on
For why?
Because of the way that he looks and the way he talks, just like his demeanor.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I love this character.
Yeah.
What the hell is wrong with people?
Yeah. Well, who the F knows, but I think there is a set of, I bet you anything, 99% of the haters of Will Poulter are the people who hate Disney, who hate Kathleen Kennedy, who hate the new Star Wars movie, particularly Episode 8, who hate the new, Ghostbusters movie for the fact that it had women.
But this guy is a white male.
Yeah, I can't remember the details, but it's mainly like the way that he looks, I think, and the way that he talks. And maybe it's because he's also portraying like a computer whiz that sort of touches on certain soft points in this community. Because this community is mainly computer nerds without a social life.
I got to read up on this because this pisses me off preemptively.
Right. So in the past few days, he's gotten so much hate Twitter action.
Oh my God.
That he has to close his account.
I want to start a GoFundMe to send him a shit ton of money.
Well, so most people are like you and me.
Yeah.
And so there's been enough of us reaching out to him saying like, what the hell? You were awesome in this.
I want to reach out to him.
Yeah.
How do you reach out to him if he closed his Twitter?
I don't know. Write him a letter, snail mail.
God damn it.
So let's talk about the music. So it starts off with Relax. Frank.
By the way, I recently commented on British shows have the best music. Just British shows in general, let alone Black Mirror and stuff. Like they always just have great music. I watched recently this series called Sally Forever on HBO. Have you seen it? That's a show that, oh my God, we should do a whole separate thing on that. But like the music is great. And so anyways, I'll just start with that. And yes, the music in this one was awesome because it was 80s and it was British 80s.
And early 80s.
Early
too.
80s, yeah.
So, we're not getting into the winger and the,
right.
Early 80s. So Relax, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, great song. I can't justify its existence, but I love it. Eurythmics, Here Comes the Rain Again. That's if you put in the Now To tape.
Right, which I didn't try the first 20 times. I just picked the Thompson Twins.
And that, the Thompson Twins is one of those bands from the 80s that doesn't get enough resurgence love.
Yeah.
There's certain bands from the 80s that get a ton of attention.
Right.
Duran Duran, Journey maybe, Depeche Mode maybe, these kinds of bands. But Thompson Twins, solid 7 songs that are really great and really transport me back.
Great writing, great lyrics, great everything, yeah.
The ending song in 16 Candles I actually covered. If you want to listen to it, go to Kirk Honda at SoundCloud. I actually created a cover of anyway.
Nice. I'll have to check that out.
I did. So instead of recreating the keyboards, I did the whole thing on acoustic guitar.
Oh, nice.
Kajagoogoo, Too Shy. Great song. XTC, Winona making plans for Nigel.
Oh, I didn't know who it was. I knew the song.
Oh, XTC. Okay. XTC was a great band. I remember really liking them in the 80s. I remember them kind of scaring me in a certain way because they have some weird music.
Yeah.
Phaedra, you see that album Phaedra.
So I remembered that album. I think Shun might have had it or something. But I remember, I didn't know much about them, but I remember that album.
Yeah. Tangerine Dream is the band, and the album Phaedra is from 1974.
Okay.
And so those instrumental songs you hear after he gets that album are from 1974.
From 74. Like, and it's all electronic, beautiful.
Like in sequenced music and stuff. Like
and the other one I definitely had not heard of.
That is Tomita, Japanese guy, also from the 70s, also cutting edge electro stuff.
Okay. Now, if you looked at, did you see the list really quick? Because Colin had written him out a list of music to listen to.
I didn't look at it.
It had, I didn't see all of them, but it had The Cure, it had Bauhaus.
I do remember that, yeah.
The other thing is Colin, when he first is introduced and he takes his headphones off, did you hear what he was listening to?
New Life.
That's right.
By Depeche Mode, yeah. And I instantly was like, oh, I get it.
I actually didn't hear it the first time because
I think the first time he might be listening to something else.
Oh, it might be.
Yeah.
Because it was like a later watching where I finally was like, oh, that's Depeche Mode.
Right, but the New Life, because that was the second life.
Oh, that's brilliant if that's true.
I think that's what happened.
Gosh, that would be brilliant.
And other point, I looked this up on the internet. I don't know where these songs were, but Lorenzo Senni, another electro song, and Laurie Anderson, Oh Superman. She was from the 70s, 80s. She did a lot of weird electro stuff, artsy stuff.
Hey, was that poster in Colin's room behind him? Was that Akira or was that something else? The big explosion looking thing in black and white.
I didn't see it.
It looked like a scene from Akira where the
80s stuff. Let's talk about what do you remember about the 80s particular?
So first of all, of course, the Sinclair the computer.
I looked it up and they said it was the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, by the company Sinclair.
Oh, okay.
It was a British company and
Did you know about this in the 80s?
I didn't own one, but totally, that was a famous one.
I had never heard of this one.
If you were into programming, it was one of the ones out there.
when I saw it in the show, I thought, oh, did they make up a console?
Oh, I see.
But I certainly remember Commodore 64.
And he says, it's got a great sound chip, which it did. It had awesome audio. That was the best thing about the Commodore 64 was it could do, I think 8 sounds at once or something like that.
So my friend, Chris Glover, he had a Commodore 64, and I remember kind of messing around on it back in the day. And it had the memory tape deck that you had to, audio data that you would listen. Did you get to that ending where you listened?
I didn't. I saw it on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's just some long ass combination that you had to do to get to it.
Right.
And then did you know what it leads to?
To a game or at least to a website where you can play Nosedive.
Well, but it was because
you need a Spectrum simulator.
Right, because the recording is the recording of the program from a tape. And then when you play that into the simulator, as if you were loading the tape into memory, it's this QR code, and the QR code takes you to the website. It's crazy they did that. It's so cool.
Totally, yeah. So I remember playing around with the Commodore 64, but I've since learned that people really respected that computer as like a massive step forward in personal computing.
So I had Commodore 64 Envy because my cousin had one, and I had a Tandy color computer.
Right, which you have a new...
I have a Tandy color computer 3, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the color computer on the one hand was a very fun system, but there were 2 issues with it. One of them, the sound sucked. You could only do one sound at a time. So when you're hearing a melody in it and stuff, you can never play 2 notes simultaneously. Here you have the Commodore 64 with full multi-timbral capability going bling, 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 chords.
Chords, yeah.
Right? Amazing. Not only that, the Commodore 64 audio, like the range of sounds it could reproduce was greater, right? Now, the color computer did have the ability to do synthesized sound, like so you could grab a recording and play it back. That was kind of cool. So there were some games that actually had like a little audio snippets. So for example, Predator and RoboCop, you would hear like, if it bleeds, we can kill it, stuff like that, which I thought was super cool. But
voice synthesizer.
Yeah, like you could synthesize voice, yeah.
Yeah.
But the Commodore 64 had so many more games for it, and it was just so, oh my god! So I always wanted one of those, but I had the other one.
Yeah, other 80s stuff. Choose Your Own Adventure books, as we talked about. I loved those when I was a kid. I wanted as many as I could get. And as an adult, I bought a bunch of them, and I had a big stack, and then I ran out of room on my bookshelf, and I only kept one, the Third Planet from Altair, which I remember reading a lot because it was about space.
Right.
Because there were other Choose Your Own Adventure about like going into a haunted house or something. I mean, it didn't really turn me on, but going into space.
I had one about pirates that was really fun.
Old video games that were being played. Just the mention of sprites actually brought me back to the 80s. Do they still use that term, sprites?
Not really, because like everything is a 3D engine these days.
Oh, okay.
So even games that are 2D, most often nowadays it's a 3D engine where you just have equivalent of sprites, but they're still rendered on a 3D surface.
Okay.
But yeah, back then it was sprites is how you drew things.
Right.
So.
Was he programming in BASIC?
Yeah, which is weird because in most games that were gonna be like really hardcore graphically and stuff like that, you'd have to do it in assembly because BASIC is too slow.
Oh.
So, like for example, if you're
But
gonna,
his game was kind of slow though.
but it wouldn't be because I don't know if you noticed, like when the screens would show up, like the monster would render instantly and stuff like that. In BASIC, you would have seen the lines drawing in because BASIC is an execution, like an interpreted language. So like every line has to be compiled in the moment and then run instead of a compiled language. And so what people would do for these systems is they would write it in assembly, and it was all basically pre-compiled, and it was way faster to do it that way.
Wasn't there a function in BASIC where you could compile things?
Well, yeah, and you could also do a BASIC program that basically what it did was actually just load stuff into memory. Yeah. And so then it's sort of like writing it in assembly, where the only thing that the BASIC program is doing is grabbing data from somewhere and slotting it into the right slots at the right time. But still, that was still not as efficient as just writing in assembly. So I was a little surprised they did that, but it was kind of fun because I wrote a lot of BASIC when I was a kid. So
yeah.
Yeah.
The Spectrum, apparently it was big in the UK, not in the United States. Just a tiny little keyboard with a computer inside and these weird rubber keys.
Yeah.
I looked at
I never had one of those.
I looked at the specs. It had 16K of memory total, the first version did, compared to my computer that we're recording on right now has 20 terabytes of memory, which, I don't know, like a billion times the memory.
Yeah, because the funny thing is, there wasn't even the concept of a hard drive.
Right.
You just had RAM, read-only memory, and...
Well, I guess your hard drive would have been the tape deck, right?
The tape deck, which is super slow, and it always... Oh, man, that was...
And it would crap out, right? Cause,
totally.
Yeah, I remember using the 64, and then like I'd program... I'd take 5 hours at Glover's house, and I'd do this whole thing, and then we'd have to save it, because I think when you turn it off, it's gone. It disappears.
It's all in memory.
So yeah, so you'd hook up the tape deck thing, and it would take, I don't know, 10 minutes. like 10 minutes to like record, a pretty simple program.
Yeah.
And then, a week later, I'd pop the tape in, try to reload. Error. Yeah. So it's
totally.
Like, okay.
It was a pain, man.
That's gone,
So I remember the first time I got the 5 1/4 discs for the color computer. And even that was a vast improvement.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, those were fairly reliable, if my memory serves. Yeah. The CPU was 3.5 megahertz, which is about a thousandth the speed of my... But so my computer right here is 4 gigahertz, which isn't super fast, but fast enough.
It's as fast as they get these days because they stopped going that direction.
Right.
It was in the 90s. It was all about like, it was getting faster and faster.
Well, now it's quad core and stuff,
it's
right?
all multiple cores.
So that was my question is like, so that could, the spectrum was a thousandth the speed, but that seems like not enough of a difference. It seems like, is my computer actually only 1,000 times faster than the spectrum?
No, because A, you do have multiple cores. B, your RAM is ridiculously faster. And the bus between the hard drive and the RAM is way faster than you would have with a disk, for example, right? So overall, your computer is way faster. Not only that, it's not just your CPU. Now you have a graphics card that's dedicated to the graphics.
Right.
Back then, that was your chip.
Right.
That one did everything.
Right. Actually, I learned that Bandersnatch was a real game in 1984, by the way.
Yeah, but they renamed it or something.
It was highly anticipated. I didn't know they renamed it, but it was supposed to be like super complicated and cool, just like this game, but it was never released, and the software company that was developing it closed.
Okay, so they never released it.
Yeah.
Because I thought, I had heard that there was something called that, but I didn't think it actually was called that in the end. But
there was one thing about the show Bandersnatch that I thought was not very 80s. Can you think of what it was? It's a kind of a small detail, but there's one thing where I was like, oh, I don't think that's very 80s.
In the show?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't know.
It was the book cover. The lock the door, get the key, whatever.
Really?
To me, that book cover looked too modern, or too modern retro, if that makes any sense, Anyway.
Like it was too fancy looking or something?
It looked like the sort of cover and even the sort of paperback material of a book of today, rather than of the sorts of books you would see, particularly on someone's desk in 1984 that was probably published 5 years earlier. Like there's a certain look that books had in the late 70s that this book didn't seem to have for me. Anyway.
I see.
Okay.
That's interesting that you caught that.
Yeah. Some Easter eggs. Pax the demon is the thief of destiny. So, that's a theme. The metalhead game was throughout the entire episode. The white bear symbol and the white bear video game. There's a white bear video game too that had a poster.
And the
nosedive game, which is a reference to the past episode. 1984, the book Controlled by Government. Lots of talk about video games and decisions and time and reality and free will.
By the way, did you do the sequence where when the fight starts, you say jump through the window?
No, I didn't.
So did you read what happens?
No, but
basically it goes to this. It breaks the fourth wall where they're filming the Netflix show.
Yeah.
And then the actors all confused, and they're like, "What are you doing? You're supposed to like fight back. This is that scene." And he's like that's an ending. Like
I didn't see that one, but I read about it and thought I wish I would have seen it.
That's super meta, right? Like meta.
So I went back and tried to do some of these other routes, but I was like, I'm gonna have to sit here and watch the entire episode again.
That is one thing that.
But I like that because it makes it more real,
Yeah. Well, like I said, doing it. There was one time we restarted it from the beginning, and then I went ahead and did it again with someone else, and then did it again. So I've restarted from the very beginning a total of 4 times, or started from the very beginning 4 times. But then certainly did the thing many times where they send you back partially, and then it like rewind or re-shows you a few of the scenes to catch you up to where you are.
There's a lot of different references to other Black Mirror episodes. St. Juniper Hospital is where the
I didn't catch that.
Her name is Dr. Haynes, and
what's that one from?
The proprietor of the Black Museum was Rollo Haynes, so maybe they're related. Playtest was actually in Playtest, the old episode. There was a magazine and there were a list of game reviews. One of which was Bandersnatch, and that was like a few years ago.
Oh wow! Oh, also the Tucker Soft, I guess. Right. In some of the software episodes, the company's Tucker, but like without the U.
TCKR or something. Yeah. When you go, did you do the timeline where you end up in the present day?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I consider the winning timeline.
Yeah, people consider that to be kind of like the end all be all. I didn't make it to that one until after the credits or something, where it sort of lets you
go.
Yeah. There's a news crawl on the TV that talks about former Prime Minister Michael Callow wins Celebrity Bake Off.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
He was the pig.
And also on the website, if you go to their website, one of their games is
Pig and poke.
Pig and poke. Yeah.
Pig and a poke. Yeah. Also, another talks about Liam Monroe from the Waldo Political Opponent episode.
By the way, the show they would keep showing, that was the game review show.
Yeah.
Where it's like,
yeah, the kid.
I loved those segments because that was totally like shows I would have loved back then.
Yeah.
That were all geeky. Like there was this one called Beyond 2000. Do you ever remember that show?
No.
It was a show where they would talk about like future technology and all these kinds of things. And just the thought of that, there was this UK program that would be reviewing all these episodes, all these games and things like that.
Which probably didn't exist, right?
I don't know, but it's just
1984, a video, like a TV show. I mean, maybe the BBC was more advanced.
It looked just so good. I was like, oh my God, I would have loved this show.
Yeah, well, at the very least, the actors and the writing of it felt very real.
Well, and then every time you saw her, she was talking about a different future technology. Like, and this will be the virtual reality in the future. And blah, blah.
Yeah, I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
A lot of other episodes were referenced, the Hang the DJ, the USS Callister, 50 Million Merits, Wraith from the Asshole Judge from 15 Million, Wraith Gold Band cigarettes. The cigarettes were Wraith. Okay. What do you think about all these references to these past episodes?
So this is the way I'm totally fine with them referencing, instead of the one we don't like.
Black Mirror.
Yeah. Well,
the episode that shall not be named.
Yeah. Because this is more like little Easter eggs, right?
Yeah.
And also in this one, because it is so meta, right? Like, I'm like, cool. I'm like, all right, fine. The game is called this. Oh, and you had a game that was this. But it doesn't make sort of a statement like it was always all tied together. Because this one is really more like, oh, there's all these dimensions and blah, 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 blah. I like this approach.
I was fine with it for the first bit of time, but as I looked on the internet and found all the different Easter eggs, I'm like, okay, this is a bit of masturbatory practice.
Sure.
It's like, just write a goddamn story,
Okay.
Like, and I'm worried that Brooker is going up his own asshole.
I see.
And every episode is going to, and he's trying to appeal to the internet too much or something.
I certainly would have liked if this was the only example of that, and only because this is the interactive kind that's a meta episode and blah, blah, blah. I don't like it in general, because we talked about this before. I didn't need to pretend all these stories were all connected.
Well, in Black Museum, it ruined almost all the other episodes, because we talked about it when we did that episode last year. Like, if you logically walk yourself through the fact that Black Museum is real,
right,
then all these things, it just threw everything off. It invalidated half of the episodes that I loved. And so there's no reason for this. There's zero reason. When you're watching an episode like White Christmas, I don't need to be aware of the fact that Brooker is sprinkling in things from other episodes. I want to lose myself in the story. I don't want to be constantly jolted out of the story by like, oh yeah, I get it. Brooker is sprinkling shit in everywhere.
It would be a lot more impactful if it was rarely and very tastefully done.
Right.
Like there was one episode where you're like, oh my God, that was that one thing.
Or many years later, like when I learned in episode 3, which isn't a great episode of Star Wars, that when they're in the Senate, one of the aliens, because there's those thousands of aliens, they are ETs from
I recall that was the moment I had to excuse myself to the bathroom.
But you can't see them. They're so far in the distance that unless you freeze frame the DVD and take a snapshot and post it on the internet.
Sure.
You'll
So you're
never
saying
know.
like, fine, do your Easter egg.
That's a little funny. Yeah. Or when they do the Wilhelm scream or whatever.
Right.
Like it's like,
Right.
I hear it now.
Well,
but
you're saying you have this whole episode, first of all, on the heels of another episode where you did the same exact thing, and now
he's had 2 episodes in a row now.
It's like greatest hits
that are up his own ass.
You know what? It's almost like he's had 2 clips episodes. Remember
imagine,
the 80s, the clips?
Yeah, exactly. Imagine if we did that with this podcast. Like every time we did a podcast episode, we had all these Easter eggs of different episodes.
And I just keep mentioning the same little things over and over.
Because we know that you're going to...
Get it?
Yeah, it's just like, God, just create content. Stop trying to fold in your own bullshit. Like, now, I trust Brooker, honestly, because of all the decisions he's made so far, that this is not going to carry on. Right. So we'll see.
I see what you're saying. It bothers me now that you're mentioning it in the context of everything, but for this episode, it didn't bother me.
Right. Like I said, the first hour, I only caught some of them anyway, and it didn't throw me off. But later, it was like, okay. Especially the volume. I mean, because think of how much time and effort he spent trying to make these Easter eggs make sense within that story. Like, he probably spent 10% of the writing time on that Easter egg stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, I don't want them spending that amount of time on that silliness, you know?
One other thing I thought was cool, because I didn't catch it the first time, was in the future, in the present, the programmer gal, she's
the
Colin's daughter.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch the last name. She said, my father used to be a game programmer. For some reason, the first time around, I didn't catch it.
Yeah, I didn't catch it.
And I thought that was neat. I definitely liked the meta ending where you're still making choices even for her, even though she's watching the beginning of the Netflix that she's making. You know, I thought that was cool.
Right. Yeah, I like that whole thing. Yeah, the idea is that when you start creating a world where you're manipulating other people's choices, some other entity enters into your life and starts manipulating your choices. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Thanks for joining us. Let us know what you think. You can comment or email us at contact@psychologyinseattle.com. And take care of yourself. Please make that choice, because
I think you might or may not deserve it.